My first contact with Shaquille O'Neal wasn't in person, but through a television screen that illuminated our basement on a cold winter night in Charlotte. I was just a skinny 10-year-old boy, son of NBA player Del Curry, watching with wide eyes and a pounding heart as that 7'1" giant dominated the court in a way that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. It was as if he came from another planet, a force of nature so imposing, so surreal, that he made other players look like insignificant dwarfs around him. That image, Shaq rising above everyone, dunking with a force that seemed to shake the very ground, was imprinted on the fabric of my memory like a photo frozen in time. I can still feel the emotional impact of that moment, the breath caught in my throat, the shiver running down my spine as I witnessed something that transcended the simple game of basketball. Because there are moments in life that mark watersheds, instants that remain engraved in our memory, forever, defining who we are and who we dream to be. For me, seeing Shaq play for the first time was one of those transformative moments. The way he moved that immense body with the grace of a dancer and the power of a moving train, the way the backboards trembled and seemed about to shatter when he dunked, the contagious smile that illuminated his face after each dominant play, all of this created such a profound impression on me that even decades later, I can relive every detail with crystalline clarity. What truly hypnotized me wasn't just his enormous physical size, but the size of his presence, the magnetic aura that surrounded him like an invisible force field. When Shaq entered a court, the air seemed to change density. He attracted every gaze, commanded the attention of every person present in the gymnasium, from the fans in the stands to the opposing players who seemed to shrink before his imposing shadow. For a kid like me, who slept hugging a basketball and dreamed of one day stepping onto the same courts as my father, Shaq represented something almost mythical, a living legend of basketball, a titan among men. What many don't know, what took me years to discover, is that behind that seemingly invincible strength, that confidence that overflowed in every movement, there was a story of overcoming that made his journey even more extraordinary. Shaquille grew up in a disciplined military home, constantly moving from base to base, with a strict stepfather, Sergeant Philip Harrison, who instilled in him an iron discipline and a sense of responsibility that would shape his character forever. Imagine a boy already physically different from everyone around him, having to constantly adapt to new schools, new environments, new social groups. The constant relocation meant that Shaq had to learn to reinvent himself quickly, to adapt like a social chameleon, to create instant connections in worlds that were always changing under his feet. This nomadic education forced upon him an extraordinary resilience and adaptability that would later help him navigate the chaotic and relentless world of global fame with a grace that few can achieve. His mother, Lucille O'Neal, was his unwavering emotional pillar, his safe harbor amid the constant storms of change. While his stepfather represented discipline and structure, Lucille was unconditional love, unwavering faith, the gaze that always saw something greater in her son than simply his extraordinary physical size. She believed in Shaq's transformative potential when many only saw a boy too big for his age, awkward, and destined to be just a curiosity. This balance between severe discipline and absolute love shaped the man that Shaq would become. Strong as steel, determined as few, but also charismatic, generous, and surprisingly gentle for someone of his imposing stature. What has always deeply moved me about Shaq's story, what makes me feel a connection with him that transcends our vast physical differences, was how he transformed each obstacle into a springboard, each challenge into fuel for his success. When many would have closed off in the face of difficulties, Shaq embraced them with a broad smile and an even bigger heart. Each change of city, each new beginning, each look of curiosity or mockery became fuel for an inner fire that would propel him to heights that few would dare to dream. He didn't allow the difficulties of his childhood to define or limit him. Instead, he used them as stepping stones to achieve the greatness he always knew was his destiny. In high school in San Antonio, then in Alexandria, his already monstrous height made him stand out like a human beacon among his peers. But it wasn't just his physical stature of over 6 feet that made him special and unforgettable. It was a rare and magnetic combination of raw talent, unshakable determination, and, perhaps most importantly, a personality that illuminated every environment he entered. While many teenagers of his size might shrink from embarrassment, trying to diminish their presence to fit in, Shaq passionately embraced who he was, transforming what could be seen as an anomaly into his greatest strength, his trademark, his personal superpower. When he finally arrived at Louisiana State University, Shaq was no longer just a promise. He was a certainty, a force of nature waiting to be unleashed upon the world. Under the guidance of Coach Dale Brown, who saw in him not just an EPD, extraordinary athlete, but a young man with unlimited potential. Both on and off the court, he developed his skills exponentially, refining his raw game into something that combined brute strength with surprising technical finesse, becoming a dominant force in college basketball. His unique combination of size, power, and almost supernatural agility was something never before seen in the sport. I vividly remember watching his games on TV, sitting on the floor of our living room with my father. Beside me, both of us slack-jawed at the spectacle that young giant offered. "Watch carefully, Steph," my father would say, "because you're witnessing something that happens once in a generation." And I watched, absorbing every movement, every play, every demonstration of power and talent, feeling a seed being planted inside me. Not to be like him, as our paths would be radically different, but to find my own version of excellence, my own way of transforming my unique characteristics into strength. In 1992, the inevitable happened. Shaquille O'Neal was chosen as the first overall pick in the NBA draft by the Orlando Magic. The basketball world would never be the same. And I, even though just a child, instinctively felt that I was witnessing the birth of a legend whose shadow would extend for decades, influencing entire generations of players, including, without me being able to imagine at that moment, my own. Shaq's arrival in the NBA was like an earthquake of incalculable magnitude that shook the structures of the game to its deepest foundations. It wasn't a smooth entrance, it wasn't a gradual adaptation. It was an explosion of talent, charisma, and power that instantly redefined the expectations of an entire league. In his rookie season, he dominated with an authority that few rookies in history had managed to demonstrate, deservedly winning the Rookie of the Year award, and making it clear, with each dunk that made the entire gym tremble, that a new era of basketball was beginning. The Magic, a young franchise still seeking its identity in the league, found in Shaq not just a remarkable player, but a catalyst for dreams, a symbol of unlimited possibilities, a leader whose magnetic charisma and phenomenal talent would put them on the world basketball map. He wasn't just the face of the franchise, he was its beating heart, its vibrant soul, its embodied future. What always deeply fascinated me about Shaq's game, what made me press my nose against the TV screen trying to absorb every detail of his movements, was the seemingly impossible, almost paradoxical combination of raw power with a technical finesse that defied logic. There was a wonderful contradiction in seeing him move that immense body with the grace of someone much smaller, executing spins and post moves with a delicacy that dramatically contrasted with the violence of his devastating dunks. He wasn't just a big player. He was an extraordinary athlete who understood basketball at an almost instinctive, almost transcendental level. His ability to dominate the paint was something that bordered on the supernatural, making experienced defenders, men who had dedicated their lives to the sport and who were elite athletes in their own right, seem powerless, almost childlike, in the face of his post moves. "These guys are playing checkers, and I'm playing chess," he would say, with that characteristic smile that combined absolute confidence with an almost childlike joy. And he really was. There was a strategic dimension to Shaq's game that many, blinded by his size and physical strength, failed to perceive. While many centers centered their game only on physical domination, Shaq combined that power with a sharp game intelligence, an understanding of the rhythms and flows of the game, creating a style of play that revolutionized the center position in the NBA and inspired an entire generation to rethink the possibilities of inside play. The following years saw Shaq establish himself not just as a rising star, but as one of the greatest forces basketball has ever known, a phenomenon that transcended the sport and entered the territory of pop culture. His transfer to the Los Angeles Lakers in 1996 wasn't just a team change. It was a perfect marriage between a larger-than-life personality and the city that thrives on such characters, the beginning of one of the most dominant and memorable dynasties in NBA history. Alongside Kobe, Bryant, forming a duo as talented as it was volatile, under the spiritual command of legendary coach Phil Jackson, Shaq led the Lakers to 3 consecutive NBA championships between 2000 and 2002. It was a demonstration of dominance that left the sports world in awe. His performance in the 2000 NBA Finals against the Indiana Pacers remains one of the most impressive examples of individual dominance in the history of team sports, with surreal averages of 38 points and 16.7 rebounds per game, numbers that seem out of a video game, not the real world where athletes face the best defenders on the planet. What impressed me most about Shaq during that golden era of his career, what I tried to absorb and incorporate into my own approach to the game years later, was his almost supernatural ability to elevate his performance in decisive moments. When the lights were brightest and the pressure most intense, when millions of eyes were fixed on him and every movement was analyzed and criticized, that was precisely when Shaq played his best basketball. This ability to embrace moments of pressure as opportunities to shine, not as burdens to be feared, is something I've always tried to incorporate into my own game. This rare ability to transform anxiety into fuel, to use adrenaline as a talent amplifier, to thrive precisely when everything is at stake and the whole world is watching, waiting to see if you will buckle under the weight of expectations or rise above them. But Shaq wasn't just an exceptional athlete whose influence was limited to the painted lines of the court. He was a born entertainer, a showman whose personality overflowed beyond basketball and permeated the fabric of popular culture. His charisma transcended the courts and captured the imagination of the global public, even those who had never watched a basketball game in their lives. From his iconic nicknames like the Diesel, the Big, Aristotle, Superman, and dozens of others that he created with the same ease with which he dominated opponents in the paint, to his contagious smiles and exuberant celebrations after devastating dunks, he brought an energy and personality to the game that few have managed to equal in the history of the sport. He wasn't just a player you admired. He was someone you couldn't help but love, cheer for, someone whose enthusiasm for the game and for life was so contagious that it transcended rivalries and personal preferences. I vividly remember watching him with my father, sitting side by side on the sofa, both amazed at the spectacle unfolding before our eyes. Even being an NBA player himself, my father looked at Shaq with the same fascination I did. "That's how a great man plays," my father would say, his eyes shining with professional admiration. "Watch how he uses his body, Steph. Watch how he understands his strengths, how he doesn't try to be something he's not, how he embraces his uniqueness and transforms it into his greatest advantage. Watch how he imposes his will on the game, how he bends reality around him instead of submitting to it." These lessons, transmitted from father to son, as we watched that giant dance on the court with a grace that defied his physical dimension, were imprinted on my heart and mind. Even though my own playing style ended up developing in a completely different direction. I, the skinny long-distance shooter. He, the dominant center who reigned absolute close to the basket. The principles I learned watching Shaq shaped my approach to basketball and, in many ways, to life. After the glorious years with the Lakers, Shaq's passages through the Miami Heat, Phoenix Suns, Cleveland Cavaliers, and Boston Celtics showed different facets of his greatness. Like a multifaceted diamond, each angle revealed a new dimension of his talent and character. Even when his body no longer responded with the same explosiveness, even when the years began to take their inevitable toll on his joints and muscles, his game intelligence, his vocal and silent leadership, and his presence on the court continued to positively impact his teams. With the Heat, he formed an unlikely but devastating partnership with a young Dwyane Wade, helping guide the franchise to its first NBA championship in 2006. It was an impressive demonstration of his ability to adapt and evolve as a player, to accept a different role than the one he had played for most of his career, showing a humility and willingness to put collective success above individual glory that contradicted the inflated ego image that some critics attributed to him. Shaq's greatness on the court is undisputed and will be etched in the history books of sports forever. 4 NBA championships, 3 Finals MVP awards, 1 regular season MVP, 15 All-Star Game selections, and statistical numbers that place him firmly among the greatest centers of all time. But Shaq's true legacy goes far beyond cold statistics and tangible achievements. He changed the game in a fundamental and irrevocable way, forcing teams to completely rethink their defensive strategies, to develop specific tactics to try, almost always in vain, to contain his dominance. He inspired an entire generation of players who saw in him not just an extraordinary athlete, but an example of how to embrace one's uniqueness, how to transform unique characteristics into strengths instead of limitations. And beyond the courts, he showed how an athlete can transcend their sport, how they can use their platform to influence culture, to bring joy to millions, to become a global brand without losing authenticity. In an era where so many athletes hid behind carefully constructed images by press advisors, Shaq was always real, always authentic, sometimes to the point of controversy, but always human, always genuine, always Shaquille O'Neal in his purest form. Few athletes in history have managed to transcend their sport in the extraordinary way Shaq did. While dominating basketball courts with an authority that bordered on the mythological, he was simultaneously building, brick by brick, a cultural empire that encompassed music, film, television, advertising, and business. Shaq wasn't just an exceptional basketball player, he was a cultural force, a multidimensional phenomenon that refused to be limited by expectations or pre-established categories. I vividly remember how, as a child, my relationship with Shaq went far beyond watching his performances on the courts. I watched his movies like Kazam and Steel, which, despite negative reviews, had for me the undeniable fascination of seeing that giant I admired conquering new frontiers. I listened to his rap albums like Shaq Diesel and Shaq Fu Da Return on my Walkman, impressed by his willingness to expose himself in a territory completely distinct from basketball. I spent hours playing his video games, especially Shaq Fu, that unusual fighting game that, despite its technical limitations, represented to me the boundless expansion of an athlete who refused to be just a basketball player. For me and many of my generation, Shaq represented something greater and more significant than simply an elite athlete. He was a living example, concrete proof of how an athlete could use their platform as a springboard to express themselves in multiple arenas, of how someone could refuse the limitations imposed by social expectations and explore the full breadth of their interests and talents. What always deeply impressed me, what continues to inspire me to this day when I reflect on his legacy, was his seemingly unlimited willingness to take risks, to voluntarily leave his comfort zone and expose himself to the possibility of public failure. How many NBA players at the height of their careers would have the courage to release rap albums that would inevitably be compared with professional artists? How many would risk their prestige starring in Hollywood films that could, and frequently were, mercilessly criticized by the specialized press? Shaq embraced these opportunities with the same contagious enthusiasm and unshakable confidence he demonstrated when dominating basketball courts. Some of these adventures were more successful than others, of course. Some projects flourished, others were received with scathing criticism. But what is truly remarkable is that this never prevented him from trying, never diminished his willingness to explore new territories, to constantly reinvent himself. This courage to expose oneself, to risk public failure in arenas where he didn't have the same natural advantage he possessed on basketball courts, is something I've always greatly admired and tried to incorporate into my own life. Because in the end, the greatest enemy of personal growth isn't failure. It's the fear of failure. It's the refusal to try something new for fear of others' judgment. In the mid-90s, while his NBA career reached new heights of excellence and recognition, Shaq's personal life was also undergoing significant transformations. It was during this period that he met Shawnee Nelson, a woman of dazzling beauty and ambition that rivaled his own, a strong personality who shared his love of the spotlight and his willingness to navigate the complexities of fame. The chemistry between them was something palpable, electric, impossible to ignore, even through television screens or the pages of magazines that eagerly followed every step of their relationship. Their romance quickly became an object of obsessive fascination for the media and millions of fans, a modern love story between a titan of the courts and a woman who possessed an equally brilliant light of her own. The two married in an extravagant ceremony in 2002, forming what appeared to be, in the world's eyes, the perfect couple. Beautiful, charismatic, successful, living a modern fairy tale under the incessant spotlights of fame. Shawnee wasn't just a decorative figure in Shaq's life. She wasn't just the player's wife, as so often happens in the sports world. She had her own career, her own aspirations, her own distinct identity that intertwined with his without being eclipsed by his imposing shadow. Together, they became one of the most powerful, influential, and glamorous couples in the world of sports and entertainment. Publicly, the projected image was of a perfect and enviable romance, a happy and fulfilled family living a life of luxury, privileges, and constant joys that most people could only dream of. Magazines printed their photos in dazzling mansions, exclusive parties, and exotic vacations, painting the image of a happiness without cracks, of a love proof against any storm. But as many of us end up learning throughout our own journeys through life, myself included, with my own experiences and personal challenges, appearances can be deeply deceiving. Behind the carefully positioned cameras, away from the vigilant eyes of the public always eager for a new story, their relationship faced significant challenges that were rarely exposed in the glossy pages of celebrity magazines. The constant absence due to the endless travel required by an NBA career, the relentless and often invasive media attention that allowed no real privacy, and the endless demands of Shaq's stardom began to weigh like an increasingly difficult burden to sustain on the marriage. The cracks, invisible to the public but painfully real to those involved, began to form in the foundations of that relationship that seemed, from the outside, absolutely perfect. While Shawnee was busy managing her own rising career, diligently caring for the children they shared, and trying to create a sense of stability and normalcy in a life that had very little normalcy, Shaq was consumed by his global celebrity life, navigating an ocean of temptations, adulations, and privileges that invariably accompany fame at its highest level. It's a story we unfortunately see repeated endlessly in the world of sports, entertainment, and any arena where extreme fame is a factor. The almost unbearable external pressure that falls on relationships that are already challenging by nature. The public scrutiny, the unrealistic expectations, the constant separation, the omnipresent temptations, all these factors combine to create an environment where even the strongest and most genuine bonds are tested to their limits and, frequently, beyond them. As someone who grew up in a family intimately connected to the world of professional basketball, I saw up close, from an early age, how these pressures can infiltrate the most solid relationships, how they can slowly wear away the emotional foundations of families, how they can create invisible but real distances between people who truly love each other. I saw how the constant absence of a father touring with his team, the temptations that accompany fame and money, and the relentless public attention can test even the deepest and most sincere bonds. What makes this part of Shaq's story so powerfully moving to me? What makes me feel a deep human connection with someone so different from me in so many ways is the dramatic and touching contrast between his absolute and unquestionable dominance on basketball courts and his deeply human, painfully identifiable struggles off them. This contrast reminds us, with an almost painful clarity, that even those who seem invincible in one aspect of life, those who have reached the pinnacle of success in their areas of excellence, can be just as vulnerable, just as fallible, just as deeply human in other dimensions of their existence. No one, not even a 7'1" giant who dominates world basketball with an almost mythological authority, is immune to the challenges and complexities of human relationships, to the fragilities of the heart, to the character flaws that all of us, at some point in our lives, demonstrate. Seeing Shaq, a man who seemed capable of bending the world to his will on the courts, struggling with the same personal and relational demons that so many of us face, doesn't diminish his greatness in my eyes. On the contrary, it adds a dimension of humanity that makes him even more inspiring. Because in the end, it's not our triumphs that define us most deeply as human beings, but how we face our falls, how we deal with our failures, how we find strength to get up when we fall hardest. There is an inherent and inescapable fragility to the human condition that doesn't discriminate between ordinary people who walk anonymously through the streets and superstars whose faces are recognized in every corner of the planet. a fundamental vulnerability that connects us all, regardless of fame, fortune, or achievements. Shaquille O'Neal, despite his truly imposing physical stature, his dominant presence that seemed to fill any environment he occupied, was not exempt from this universal truth that brothers, all souls that inhabit this planet. And perhaps that is the most powerful, most moving, and most transformative lesson his extraordinary journey offers us. While his NBA career reached unprecedented heights, collecting awards, records, and global acclaim, his personal life was quietly crumbling, like a beautiful and imposing sandcastle being slowly eroded by the invisible but relentless tide. The crushing pressures of fame at a level that few human beings in history have experienced, the constant travel that kept him away from home for weeks and months, the relentless and often cruel media attention that documented his every move, and the overwhelming expectations that millions of people placed on his broad shoulders took an emotional toll that no million-dollar contract could compensate for. Shaq's life had become an incessant whirlwind of appearances, training sessions, games, commercial commitments, and public obligations that left him with very little time to focus on the people who really mattered: his wife, his children, his family. The same bright lights that illuminated his glory on the courts seemed to blind his vision to the most important and fundamental things in life. Shaq and Shawnee's marriage, which publicly seemed so perfect, so enviable in the glossy pages of celebrity magazines, began to silently wear down under the weight of these constant and relentless pressures. Shaq's personal demons, fragilities, and impulses that he had carefully hidden from the public eye for years began to surface in ways that could no longer be ignored or hidden. His infidelities, impulsive choices made in moments of loneliness or weakness during endless tours with the NBA, became more frequent and increasingly difficult to hide from the relentless scrutiny of tabloid media and, more importantly, from Shawnee's painful knowledge. It's easy to judge from a distance. It's terribly simple to point out flaws and morally condemn when we observe others' lives from the comfort of our living rooms, protected from the public scrutiny that people like Shaq face daily. It's tempting to reduce complex people to simple caricatures of virtue or vice, especially when it comes to public figures whose lives seem so distant from our everyday realities. But who among us can really understand in its entirety what it means to live under the relentless and inescapable microscope that Shaq faced every minute of every day? Who can truly understand the constant temptations, the crushing pressures, the expectations impossible to fully satisfy that accompany fame and celebrity status at its most extreme magnitude? Who can state with certainty that, placed in the same circumstances, with the same pressures and opportunities, they would make radically different choices? This is not, in any way, an attempt to justify his actions. And Shaq himself would be the first to vehemently affirm this. His mistakes were real. The wounds he caused were deep. The consequences of his choices left scars that time may attenuate but never completely erase. But this inescapable reality invites us to a deeper and more nuanced reflection on the complex nature of fame and its transformative and often destructive impact on the people who experience it at its most extreme levels. It reminds us, with painful clarity, that behind the sensationalist headlines, the spectacular highlights on the courts, and the impressive statistics, there are flesh and blood human beings struggling with their own deeply rooted insecurities, painfully human weaknesses, and inner demons that all the fame and fortune in the world cannot exorcise. For Shawnee, the repeated betrayals caused an emotional pain whose depth few of us can really comprehend. Imagine building your life alongside someone, sharing dreams, raising children, facing the ups and downs of existence together, only to discover that the person with whom you shared all this repeatedly violated the sacred trust that forms the basis of any meaningful relationship. Despite the genuine love she still felt for Shaq, the privileged lifestyle they shared, and the family they had built together, she eventually made the difficult but necessary decision to file for divorce. It wasn't an impulsive or vindictive choice, but a painful and considered decision born from the understanding that some wounds are too deep to be completely healed, that some behavior patterns are too difficult to break, and that her own emotional well-being and self-respect demanded this separation. The impact of this rupture was profound and devastating for both, in ways that go far beyond the financial details that often dominate headlines about celebrity divorces. For Shaq, it represented a moment of inevitable confrontation with reality, a direct and inescapable confrontation with the consequences of his choices and the deep wounds he had caused not only to Shawnee, but to his children and his own soul. The end of his marriage forced him to face head-on, without the possibility of escape, the raw and painful reality of his actions and the waves of suffering they had generated. It is in these moments of profound failure and painful reflection that we often find the seeds of genuine and lasting transformation. For Shaq, the end of his marriage marked not only the conclusion of an important and defining chapter in his life, but also the beginning of an arduous journey of self-discovery and personal growth that would continue through the following years. What deeply touches me, what makes my heart fill with even greater respect for this man I already immensely admired as an athlete, is his extraordinary courage in facing his mistakes publicly. In a world where public figures often hide behind carefully crafted statements by public relations teams, where empty apologies are offered only when absolutely necessary to protect brands or contracts, Shaq chose the infinitely more difficult path, openly admitting his failures, taking complete responsibility for his actions without excuses or justifications, and actively and visibly working to become a better person, a more present father, a more integral man. In revealing interviews, painfully honest memoirs, and public appearances where he didn't shy away from the most difficult questions, he spoke openly about his mistakes, expressing genuine and visceral regret for the suffering he caused to those he loved most. This impressive vulnerability, this willingness to expose himself in his lowest and most shameful moments, reveals a moral courage that few possess, an inner strength that paradoxically manifests most clearly in the recognition of his own weaknesses. "I was wrong," he said in an interview that remained permanently etched in my memory, his words carrying an emotional weight that no scriptwriter could forge. And when you're wrong, especially when you hurt people you love, you need to admit it. There are no excuses, no justifications. I failed as a husband. I betrayed the trust of the woman I loved, the mother of my children, and I have to live with that every day of my life. Hearing those words, I felt a lump in my throat and tears forming in the corners of my eyes. Not because I was judging Shaq for his mistakes. Who am I to judge? But because I recognized in that moment the true greatness that transcends championships, statistics, and halls of fame. The greatness of a man capable of facing his most painful failures with absolute honesty, of taking unreserved responsibility for his actions, and of using even his most shameful mistakes as catalysts for growth and transformation. My path and Shaquille O'Neal's crossed at a particularly fascinating and significant moment in the ongoing evolution of basketball. While he represented the peak, the culmination of an era defined by relentless physical domination in the paint, I was helping pave the way for a fundamental redefinition of the game based on the deadly precision of long-distance shots. We were, in many concrete and symbolic aspects, representatives of completely opposite game philosophies, living embodiments of two different eras of the same sport. When we first met in person at an NBA event, I was just a young 6'3" guard, skinny and seemingly fragile, beginning to attract attention in the world of professional basketball. My ability to consistently make three-point shots from distances that few players before had even considered possible was beginning to redefine the tactical parameters of the game and represented a completely new, almost revolutionary direction, different from that which had defined and celebrated Shaq's extraordinary career. The contrast between our styles, our physiques, and our approaches to the game couldn't be more dramatic or more evident. Where Shaq thrived in brutal and intense physical battles close to the basket, using his body as an unstoppable weapon, completely dominating defenders with his superior strength and size, and dunking the ball with a violence that made the backboards tremble and spectators go wild. My game was built around finesse, technical delicacy, millimetric precision, and the almost supernatural ability to make shots from distances that defied the conventional logic of basketball. It was as if we were playing the same sport, but speaking completely different languages, expressing ourselves through opposite dialects of the same fundamental language of basketball. One of us represented the raw and imposing force of nature, irresistible and overwhelming. The other, the technical precision and finesse that could overcome physical limitations through skill and intelligence. Together, without realizing it at that moment, we were illustrating the wonderful beauty and infinite diversity that make basketball such a fascinating and universally loved sport. What always deeply impressed me about Shaq, what highlighted to me his true greatness beyond any statistic or trophy, was his genuine and enthusiastic willingness to embrace the natural evolution of the game. While many veterans of his generation bitterly resented the changes that were transforming basketball, nostalgically lamenting the loss of the era of dominating big men and criticizing the new style of play based on three-point shots as a perversion of the true fundamentals, Shaq demonstrated a sincere intellectual curiosity and a deep respect for the new style of game that I and other players of my generation were bringing to basketball. In our conversations, which became more frequent and deep over the years, he always showed a genuine and authentic interest in understanding the tiniest technical details of the three-point shot, the exact positioning of the feet, the perfect alignment of the elbow, the precise moment of releasing the ball. He asked me about the countless hours of obsessive and solitary practice necessary to develop that kind of almost supernatural precision, about the specific mental conditioning required to maintain confidence even after a sequence of missed shots, about how I mentally visualized the game during those crucial moments when the ball was in the air and the fate of an entire match depended on its trajectory. There wasn't even a shadow of generational competition between us, not a trace of that bitterness, disguised as wisdom that often characterizes the discourse of retired legends when confronted with the new directions of their sport. There was only a genuine and deep mutual respect between two athletes who, despite their evident differences, shared an intimate understanding of the sacrifice, dedication, and commitment necessary to achieve excellence in their respective styles. Shaq frequently offered me words of encouragement and sincere admiration for the way I and similar players were, helping to transform and expand the game he loved as much as I did. "You're doing things I could never do, not even in my wildest dreams," he once told me, with that characteristic smile that lit up his entire face and seemed capable of radiating warmth. And that's what makes basketball so special, so magical. There's room for giants like me, and for skinny shooters like you. There's room for brute force and for surgical precision. there's room for all forms of excellence. That genuine humility, that generosity of spirit in recognizing and celebrating forms of talent radically different from his own, impressed me deeply and left a lasting mark on my own approach to life and sport. Here was one of the greatest players of all time, a man whose physical domination on the courts had never been matched, enthusiastically recognizing and celebrating a completely different style of play from his own, an approach to basketball that, in many ways, represented the direct opposite of everything that had defined his legendary career. It was a powerful and exciting lesson about how true love for the sport, authentic respect for excellence in all its forms, transcends personal preferences, generational rivalries, and egocentric pride. It was a living example of how true greatness includes the ability to recognize and celebrate greatness in others, even when, or perhaps especially when, it manifests in ways completely different from your own. In television programs, podcasts, and NBA events where we had the opportunity to appear together over the years, I could observe firsthand, with growing fascination and admiration, how Shaq had deeply evolved as a human being since his turbulent days as a player. He still maintained that magnetic and irresistible charisma, that contagious sense of humor, and that larger-than-life personality that had made him such a universally loved figure. But there was now a new dimension of contemplative wisdom, of mature perspective, of deep understanding in his words and behavior. When we talked about the deeper aspects of life and basketball, away from the cameras and microphones, I clearly perceived that Shaq had gained a perspective that only comes through direct, sometimes painful experience of both extraordinary triumphs and devastating difficulties. His reflections on fame and its pitfalls, on family and its complexities, on legacy and its true meaning revealed a man who had done significant and transformative inner work, a man who had grown and evolved not only as an athlete or public personality, but as a human being in his totality. "Fame is like fire, Steph," he once told me in one of those private conversations, his eyes communicating a seriousness that contrasted with his normally jovial public persona. "It can warm and illuminate everything around you, but it can also consume everything you love if you don't learn to control it. I learned that the hard way. I lost things that were more valuable than any championship or MVP because I didn't understand in time that not every light that shines brings true warmth." Those words, delivered with a humility and vulnerability that dramatically contrasted with his imposing physical size, were etched in my memory and heart. They revealed a man who had gone through the purifying fire of adversity and emerged not just intact, but transformed, refined, wiser. A man who had confronted his own inner demons and, although the battle was never completely won, was determined to use his experiences, both triumphs and failures, to grow as a human being and help others avoid the same mistakes he had made. The true measure of a person, the ultimate test of their character and inner strength, is not in their ability to completely avoid falls and failures, something no human being has ever achieved throughout an entire lifetime. No, the true measure of a man or woman lies in how he or she rises after falling, in how they respond to adversity, in how they transform their mistakes into lessons and their wounds into wisdom. If we apply this profound principle to the extraordinary life of Shaquille O'Neal, we find a story of human redemption that is as inspiring and moving as any of his most spectacular achievements on basketball courts. After the painful and public end of his marriage to Shawnee and the conclusion of his legendary NBA career, Shaq found himself at a decisive moment, a true fork in the road of his journey. He could, like so many others in similar situations, have surrendered to corrosive bitterness, could have isolated himself in his vast wealth and global fame, could have allowed his mistakes and failures to define the rest of his life and shape his self-image. Instead, with a courage that finds few parallels even among the most celebrated sports heroes, he chose a fundamentally different path, an arduous path of genuine personal growth, continuous learning, and selfless service to others. It was a choice that revealed more about his true character than any championship or impressive statistic ever could. He redirected his focus, his seemingly unlimited energy, and his considerable resources to meaningful and impactful philanthropy, using his global platform not to further increase his fame or fortune, but to give back to the communities that had always supported him, especially those most vulnerable and in need. He became a passionate and effective advocate for education as a path to empowerment, establishing programs and initiatives that opened doors of opportunity for countless young people who, without this intervention, might never have had the chance to realize their full potential. His deep and genuine involvement in charitable causes, his unwavering commitment to community service, helped him rediscover a sense of purpose and meaning that far transcended the fleeting glories of professional basketball. This new focus on giving rather than receiving, on serving rather than being served, allowed him to begin a process of emotional and spiritual healing that fame and fortune by themselves could never provide. Shaq's extraordinary journey of transformation was not limited only to his public image or philanthropic activities, but extended to the most intimate and personal relationships of his life, and, perhaps most importantly, to his inner growth as a human being. His public apology to Shawnee, not a vague and generic apology formulated by press advisors, but a sincere and visceral expression of genuine regret. His continuous and consistent efforts to improve his behavior and character, and his unwavering determination to be a present, loving, and exemplary father to his children became fundamental and defining elements in his arduous path to personal redemption. What moves me deeply about Shaq's transformative journey, what makes my heart expand with renewed admiration and respect each time I reflect on it, is his extraordinary willingness to be publicly vulnerable. In a sports culture, and more broadly, social one that often celebrates and rewards toxic and inflexible masculinity, that teaches men from an early age to hide their emotions and never admit weaknesses, especially in the hyper-masculine world of professional sports, Shaq demonstrated extraordinary courage by openly sharing his vulnerabilities, his mistakes, and his process of personal growth with the world. In an era where public figures often hide behind carefully constructed facades, he chose the more difficult path of genuine authenticity, allowing millions of people to witness not only his triumphs, but also his falls, and, more importantly, his journey of redemption. During one of our last meetings, sitting in a quiet corner away from the buzz of an NBA event, Shaq looked at me with that unique combination of intensity and warmth that defined his presence and said something that will stay with me forever. "Steph, when I was young, I thought my legacy would be measured in championship rings and statistics. Now I understand that the true legacy lies in the lives we touch, the doors we open for others, and the courage to admit when we were wrong and do better afterward." This profound truth perfectly exemplifies Shaquille O'Neal's evolution from a dominant basketball player to a truly extraordinary man. His journey continues to inspire not just athletes like myself, but people from all walks of life who face their own challenges and seek their own redemption. What makes Shaq's story truly special is how he serves as a bridge between different eras of basketball, different approaches to masculinity, different conceptions of success and fulfillment. In a world often divided by generational differences, he demonstrates that mutual respect, Genuine curiosity and the willingness to learn and evolve can transcend any barrier. When I look at my own career and the changes I helped bring to the game, I feel a profound sense of gratitude for figures like Shaq, who, instead of resisting change, chose to celebrate it. And when I think about the kind of legacy I hope to leave when my time on the courts ends, I find in Shaquille O'Neal not just a model of athletic excellence, but an inspiring example of how true greatness extends far beyond sports. His story is not just about basketball, it's about redemption, growth, humility, and the courage to face our imperfections to become better versions of ourselves. And in this sense, Shaq is not just a Hall of Famer on the courts, but a Hall of Famer in the much more challenging and meaningful journey that is human life.